You cannot imagine that somebody could be that cruel, that lacking in empathy or lacking in a conscience. People, this is the key for people to hear.
A lot of people really believe that they were abused because they're weak or they're not securely attached, they're anxiously attached, or that something is wrong with them. And I think it is just such a myth, and it does so much harm for survivors to think that they're somehow responsible for their own abuse or at fault for what happened to them. I think what's really interesting is that anxiously attached people, securely attached people believe that repair is possible. And I think that has a huge part to do with this. I want to introduce my guest, Chelli Pumphrey. She's actually a returning guest. She was on in season 2 where we talked about why victims don't understand that it's abuse until one day it just sort of hits you. So Chelli, can you just reintroduce yourself, let us know who you are, and then let's get into this really good topic about attachment and super traits.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so happy to be here again with you. Thank you. I am a therapist, and I also do coaching in this realm of narcissistic abuse recovery. I've been a therapist in Colorado for 30 plus years, and I have a certification in working with narcissistic abuse survivors, and also wrote the book, Insight is 2020, How to Trust Yourself to Protect Yourself from Narcissistic Abuse and Toxic Relationships. So I've dedicated much of my life to doing this work, and I'm also a survivor. And I think that is a primary reason behind a lot of this too, is I get it. I get it from that perspective of having lived this. And now with you, we get to help lots of survivors get to the other side of their healing in this.
Yeah. And I think that's so important. You know, you touch on having personal experience, which obviously that sucks, right? We don't want people to have personal experience with this, but I also think that it really helps therapists and psychologists and coaches and everybody understand it much more deeply when you've actually lived it. I feel like there's questions and things that people bring to their therapist and try to get their therapist to understand. And you're like, no, I've been there. I get it completely. So I'm sorry that you've had that experience, and I'm glad that it has allowed you to help more people and understand this. Now, I'm sure as someone who has survived this, that you have experienced the blame and the shame that comes along with, you know, having experienced this. And I always wonder with therapists and psychologists especially, you know, shouldn't you have known better, Chelli? Like you understand all this. You understand attachment and trauma. So I think people think that you would be immune to it, but you're really not, just like everybody is not immune to it. It really can happen to anyone.
Right. Yeah, I think this is such an important topic because I've never met a survivor who has not felt some degree of shame or embarrassment about this. And I know, that was a huge factor for me being a therapist. I've worked with domestic violence and then became more closely aligned with working with narcissistic or cluster B personality abuse over the years. And I had several narcissistic relationships. And I also had some in my family growing up as well. And there was a point where I had a narcissistic partner. I did a ton of therapy. And even my therapist at the time, this was years ago before we were really even understanding this. She was really trying to treat me through this lens of you're codependent. And I'm like, this is not actually fitting. Like, it doesn't feel that way. And I could recognize that as a therapist. Like, I'm not fitting in this box of codependency. And then after doing all this work, I wound up with another narcissist for a partner. And I was just, I cannot even explain the devastation and the confusion and the shame I felt at that point because I thought I had figured it out. And it was after that relationship where I really started doing more of a deeper dive into attachment and personality and all these other factors that we're just now really beginning to understand and highlight in psychology and coaching that make us vulnerable. And it has nothing to do with being stupid, with being some doormat, codependent person. And codependency, maybe we'll talk about that here in a bit, but I just want to say it's kind of a blanket term to explain a lot of other things that we'll talk about today. It explains kind of the behaviors in one way, but it doesn't understand the root of the behavior.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. I hate when people are like, oh, you're codependent, as if, oh, well, there's your answer. It's your fault.
Right.
It's so infuriating. It's so much deeper than
Yeah.
that. And really, that's what the topic is right now, is what is the thing or things that make certain people more susceptible to it. I have this belief, I just want to start right here. I have this belief that there are people, and it's men, but I kind of even want to focus on the women who sort of feel like, oh, that happened to you. That could never happen to me. I have high self-esteem. I came from a good family. I'm too smart for that. All these sort of factors that they put in of like, I'm not one of those women that would ever find themselves in an abusive relationship, because if he was mean, if he was abusive, I would leave. I almost hate to admit that it's almost funny to me now, not that I'm laughing at anyone being abused, but at the arrogance of some that feel like it could never happen to them. Because while I was not outwardly saying that out loud, because that's an awful thing to do, I would think that I felt like it wouldn't happen to me. And then it did.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, just that belief, on top of many other things we'll explore today, will make you vulnerable, because you assume that it can't happen to you, so you're not going to even be looking for it. And when you don't know what to look for, these guys, well, whoever it might be, guy, woman, any gender expression, can come into your life and present as the most amazing human being and will catch you off guard. And sometimes it's your goodness, it's your kindness, it's your empathy, your compassion, your willingness to forgive bad behaviors, that those kinds of traits that make you a kind of a nice person or somebody who can do well with others is exactly what they target. They need somebody like that. And I bet a lot of people listening can say, yeah, I have those traits. And
Absolutely.
maybe, yeah, you grew up in a home where you didn't have abuse, you had healthy relationships, and you've never been through this. You can absolutely be a target.
It's a terrifying thought, I think, to think this can happen to anyone. I think that there's a real need for that safety of, no, you made a bad decision, Chelli. This is on you. I wouldn't make the same decision, as if that's going to protect me. And again, kind of going back to this, like, well, people who are in an abusive relationship have low self-esteem, or they have trauma issues from their childhood. We always put it on the victim for not seeing it, for not being aware of it. Meanwhile, society conditions women especially to be forgiving and to be empathetic. And meanwhile, those are the traits. It's not low self-esteem. Now, a victim may or may not have low self-esteem, but that's not the cause. The cause is actually, in my view, a lot of the goodness in us. We're going to talk about super traits and attachment as kind of two primary things today, because I see those things come up constantly. And I see attachment get blamed as the thing, right? You're just anxiously attached. So when somebody's mean to you, you pull them closer. I know it's a huge topic. And I mean, I wish this episode was like 6 hours long to go through it all in detail. But first, can you just tell people, what is attachment theory? For those that don't know what it is, what is it, and why do people think that's the thing that messes us up and gets us into these relationships?
Well, attachment theory is something that was developed by somebody called John Bowlby decades ago. And then Mary Ainsworth, she started to develop it even more. It's been very well studied and researched over the years. So it's a real thing. And essentially what we're talking about is the bond that develops between a mother and a child. I'm going to say mother just for the short version of this throughout this interview, but it could be your father, it could be an adopted caregiver, it could be, anybody that's a primary caregiver. The short version is, let's say an infant, a child comes out of the womb and starts expressing needs, and usually they're very basic. I need food. I need to be warm. I need a clean diaper. I need to be held. I need sleep. And the caregiver will come and, first of all, notice what those needs are or make an effort to try to meet those needs in an appropriate way. And then they meet the need, and then the child learns so much about relationships. Really, their whole brain, their nervous system becomes wired in a certain way because of this cycle of, I express my need is met in this way. And it happens thousands and thousands of times over, that childhood period, especially in the first 3 to 5 years, which is when attachment, kind of our global attachment style really develops. I'm going to try to make the briefest description of the 4 different styles So I'm going to skip over a ton of details here. So just know, and I know a lot of people already know a lot about attachment, but essentially to develop a securely attached child, the parent would need to meet this child's needs reliably, consistently, with warmth and nurturing. So, and this doesn't mean they meet the need perfectly 100% of the time. It's the majority of time this child is being responded to in that way. What happens is this child learns a lot of things from that. They learn that relationships are safe. They learn that they can trust others. They also learn they can trust themselves. This kind of develops later on as adults. But essentially, others are safe. My needs can be met, and I'm not too much if I need to express a need either. And that develops into people as adults who, that doesn't mean they're perfect, but they tend to do better with communication, with intimacy, with relationships. They can still get divorces. Guess what? They can still be vulnerable to this type of abuse. So that's kind of the ideal version. And I do want to say, it doesn't mean that if you have something other than a secure style, that something is wrong with you. These are simply descriptions of how you relate to others. It is not a death sentence. It does not mean you're totally messed up in any way. So please hear that. The easiest way to describe it is kind of on a spectrum, even though we kind of look at it in a different way when we're more technically looking at attachment. On one side of the spectrum is an anxious attachment, and that's where the child's needs are met inconsistently. So it's sometimes caregiver is there, sometimes they're not there, sometimes they're really loving, sometimes they might be angry or dismissive or unavailable. And that child learns that, well, basically their belief is I'm going to be abandoned or I'm afraid of abandonment. And their main kind of behavior or what kind of drives their attachment system is they have a need to be close to their caregiver. And so they will have a ton of anxiety mentally. They'll feel it in their body, feel very anxious. They will try to be in proximity to their caregiver as much as possible because when they're close, it helps that system calm down. And so as adults, anxiously attached people can become very deeply intimate with others. They tend to sometimes be more emotionally expressive, and they really can go very deep with intimacy, which isn't a bad thing. But they struggle a lot if they are with partners that are inconsistent or unavailable or hot cold, like a narcissist, let's say. Avoidant attachment is kind of this other end of the spectrum where this child's needs are not met. They're met enough for them to survive, but usually they're very inconsistent or not met at all. So this might be a baby crying because they're hungry, and instead of the parent coming and responding to their cues that they're hungry, they might ignore them for 2 hours. Or they don't offer a lot of warmth, nurturing, eye contact, consistency. They also tend to give a lot of parenting messages of, don't be a crybaby, kind of shut down your emotions, don't be vulnerable. And it's often a parent who might even have an avoidant attachment themselves that can do that. Not always, but sometimes. So they grew up to believe that relationships are not safe. I can't depend on others. And they kind of turn inward to meet their own needs, and they don't rely on others. Disorganized is where a child grows up in a home where there's a lot of neglect or abuse or a lot of chaos. And essentially what this child learns is fear when they are trying to attach to a parent. So they go into a freeze state. So their instinct is to attach, but the environment or the caregiver is terrifying, or maybe the caregiver could be abusive to this child, or the caregiver could also be being abused. Their nervous system is in a state of fight, flight, or freeze. And so let's say somebody's yelling at this mother, the father's yelling at this mother in a domestically abusive relationship, and she's afraid the baby's going to make him even more mad. So she's terrified. She goes to take care of this child in a terrified state. And that baby is, we're essentially mirroring what's going on in our caregivers' bodies. That baby learns love equals fear. And so a disorganized attachment, sometimes they can lean toward more avoidant tendencies or anxious tendencies. So people can often be confused about which style they have. But this one has a lot of trauma in childhood. The other two can as well. But sometimes it's a little harder for people to detect this, at least if you're not working with a therapist. So those are basically the 4 styles. So I'm going to pause there. I know that was a lot, but I think it's important just to get kind of a brief overview of this before we move further.
I totally agree. I think there's a lot of misinformation about these attachment styles. And, if you're anxiously attached, it's your fault, or you're just anxious, you're just clingy, you're just, avoidant. And actually, topic for a totally different episode, but a lot of people think that the abuser is an avoidant, not narcissistic or not abusive, but just an avoidant. And I just want to say that that's not necessarily true. I think that abusiveness is a choice, and that people who are avoidantly attached are not inherently abusive. So that's just a completely different thing. I also think that anxiously attached people are the ones that seem to kind of be accused of bringing it on themselves the most often, right? Like, well, you just keep chasing somebody who's bad for you. But I sort of referenced this earlier, and I kind of want to come back to this idea that belief that this person can repair, belief that repair is possible, I think is in a lot of these attachments. How do you think that sort of relates to why we think the abuser can change, or why we stay, or why we're picked? We're picked by them, not we pick them, for clarity.
First of all, I want to just share a little research. This might be helpful because I've done a lot of research on attachment styles, and there's been a lot of research about attachment and intimate partner violence, which is a bit of a wider umbrella than specifically working with narcissism, cluster B, and psychopathy types of abuse. However, we have a lot of theories that intimate partner violence and domestic violence, kind of this big umbrella, is often caused by people with personality disorders. So I'll just kind of leave that there on the side. Research says, and this was as recent as 2021, that people with anxious attachments going into a relationship are more likely to be the victims of intimate partner violence and or the perpetrators. And this speaks also to your thing of, people think like some of these abusers are just avoidant or something. And the research actually doesn't show that. Securely attached people have a negative correlation. So they actually do have a lower rate of abuse. However, we're going to talk about personality traits here in a moment. I'm going to share some of my thoughts about why we should be looking at this in a different way, because it doesn't mean securely attached people are not vulnerable. And then avoidantly attached people, they are still more likely to be abused, but it's not as high as anxiously attached. And another thing to think about is that people come into these relationships, these abusive relationships, maybe they're secure, or maybe they have an anxious attachment. The majority of them come out with an anxious attachment. So your attachment style can be shifted based on a relationship that you're in as well. I'm going to insert another topic here because I think it will pull this together in a more complete answer. So I also want to introduce the concept of personality super traits. The super traits were developed by Sandra Brown. She's the author of Women Who Love Psychopaths. And she and Purdue University did some research on, and this was only done on women, but they looked at their personality traits. There are categories of personality traits that people fall into. And if anybody wants to go and find out what their personality traits are, they can just search for Big 5 personality traits online, and there's tons of free quizzes. So what they found in their research is that these women who got sucked into these relationships, they had high degrees of agreeableness and conscientiousness. And I'm going to add, even though the research didn't totally show this, my experience is they also can have high degrees of openness. So there are those 3 traits. Now, agreeableness is the trait that makes us have empathy, that we are very optimistic. We always see the goodness in things. So just even that part there, we have a lot of empathy for this partner who maybe they've talked about their childhood trauma or how horrible all their other exes were, and we feel bad for them. Or we're very forgiving of every red flag that we see, all the horrible behaviors, we'll give them a bajillion chances. And it's the optimism, this hope, this belief that people can change, that I think comes back to this question that you're asking of why is that we keep thinking they can change? Well, if we have this agreeableness trait, and then I'm also going to add the conscientiousness trait, which is somebody who has a lot of values, a lot of integrity about their values, can be very success or goal oriented, and also sometimes, maybe a little what we would call type A-ish. But let's say you're married and your wedding vow is till death do us part and sickness and in health. And then you're having this partner who's abusing you, but you're confused because they're confusing. You might be more attached to the goal of never getting divorced than saving yourself. So, and maybe your value is, I don't give up on people. I'm loving, I have compassion. It's okay if somebody's been traumatized. I mean, I know that was something for me. I'm like, I'm a trauma therapist. I can deal with this guy who had a lot of trauma, even though he's abusing me, right? So those two traits can be very influential on what you're saying. Like, why is it that we get stuck? We believe that, they will get better. And the most important part about personality is that once we hit around age 30, our personality traits are mostly pretty much cooked into us. Like, it's hard to change our personality traits. We can become aware and we can work on managing them, but it's pretty much who we are. So if somebody's saying like, you're stupid, why would you stay with this person? It is like, it's nearly impossible without getting the right kind of treatment or coaching or awareness around how this can get you stuck in these relationships.
The loyalty piece you're really touching on here too, right? If your value is loyalty, which ties to conscientiousness, does it not?
Yeah, so there's what we call facets. They're like the little mini describers of this main trait of conscientiousness. So loyalty is a facet of conscientiousness.
It's not that it's bad to have these traits. It's bad that they're exploited. And I want that to be the focus, that the perpetrator is choosing to exploit these traits in you that are good traits. It's not like, well, you need to be less loyal. You need to have weaker values. You need, it's such a ridiculous concept when you look at this from the perspective of personality traits, not just attachment. And even then, I will also say that attachment, you have just described it all so well as a result of upbringing and a result of interactions that you had in early environments, meaning it can't be our fault. Now, we can go to therapy and learn and change and grow and become, earned secure instead of anxiously attached or avoidantly attached. I get that. But to know that, to have the resources to do that, it's just very difficult. And it doesn't mean that just because you're anxiously attached, it's your fault, or because you score high in the personality traits of agreeableness or conscientiousness that you need to now be combative and disloyal and have no values. Someone is choosing this. That really is. Like, I think exploitative people are actually not looking for weakness. And that's a huge myth in this, is like, he likes you because you're weak. Actually, narcissistic people despise weakness and they will punish you. Mental Healness, who's a self-aware narcissist, has said to me, and probably in many videos over time, but that if you get cheated on in a relationship with someone who's abusive and narcissistic, and then they beg you to stay with them, and they plead and they're on their knees and they prevent you from leaving, and you decide to stay based on the promise that they won't cheat again, they still see you as weak for forgiving them, and they'll punish you for staying.
And I think the other thing I want to add about personality in particular is when we are wired to have empathy, compassion, this flexibility, or we have integrity, we wouldn't cheat on somebody or lie to, if those are your core values or traits and you see the world that way, the thing that I struggle with sometimes the most with survivors is that it is like so impossible for them to understand that somebody could lack those things, right? Let's imagine that you have been a seeing person your whole life and you're trying to describe colors and what this thing looks like to a blind person who's been blind their entire life. That is what it can be like. And so because you cannot imagine that somebody could be that cruel, that lacking in empathy or lacking in a conscience, and you project your goodness and your traits onto them, and so assume that they are going to look at you in the same way, when in fact they aren't at all. And so people have to get that through their heads. Sometimes we've got to get it kind of hammered in there a little bit because it's hard to understand that.
I watch that be one of the most difficult things for people to really grasp, because once I think as a coach, I can get people to see this person is exploiting you, they're manipulative, they basically know what they're doing. I know that's kind of a topic in and of itself, conscious, unconscious, but they know what they're doing. It's like, but why? Once you can get your head to the place where you accept it to be true, the why is still very much there, because we see it as, why would somebody want control? Wouldn't it be easier to just love? Wouldn't it be easier to just be kind? But no, not for them. I don't think it would be easier. And I also don't know that easy is what they're looking for. We think, wouldn't you just be happier? No, not because you want peace and love and connection. They want control. So if we just look at the end goal of what the average person in theory wants, oversimplified, and the average abuser, they want power, control, dominance, superiority, and they feel so entitled. So why is a tough question. I think, again, oversimplified answer, but an important answer is just because they can. It's really that simple. I've heard Dr. Peter Salerno say that, Dr. George Simon, because they can. So all of this, this belief that they're wounded, the abuser is wounded, how do you think they sort of take all of these traits and attachments that we have and then manipulate it and exploit it for their gain? If we believe that it's caused by trauma, then how do these personality traits lean into that? And then it makes us susceptible to this, makes us vulnerable to this.
Well, it's kind of like what we said, like we have empathy for people and we can see their woundedness. And so when you can see that and you think, well, they had a lot of trauma and so they're just reacting, they're getting triggered. And we're sometimes much better at having empathy for others and not having that empathy for ourselves. And another thing that happens with narcissists, and I'm going to circle this back into attachment here, is this is very particular to the anxiously attached person, or even if you come insecure and maybe abuse will start to kind of move you in this direction. But generally, let's say you're an anxiously attached person, people with that attachment style tend to have beliefs that I'm too much or I'm not good enough. That's kind of the core belief. And let's say a narcissist in particular or psychopath with a lot of narcissistic tendencies, like they will come in and will start, once the abuse starts or once the devaluation starts and they start criticizing or putting their little jabs at you, what do? They reinforce that belief, I'm not good enough, I'm too much, through every little thing that they do. You are blamed for everything. You're gaslit. Everything's twisted around to make you feel that way. If that's already your core belief, it's like a magnet. And so it's just like, yep, that's me. You just keep building that up. And at the same time, what you're doing is, and this is how the anxiously attached system works, the anxiously attached person starts to devalue themselves more and more, which the narcissist is adding more to that. And at the same time, they are putting the narcissist or the abuser on a pedestal. They're idealizing them. And what do narcissists love more than anything? To be idealized, to be on somebody's pedestal. And it creates this vicious cycle. And I believe this is a very big and overlooked part of the trauma bond that happens. The anxious attachment system, the core thing is not to be abandoned. So it's like our brain, and whether you're disorganized, avoidant, or anxious, your brain is going to play tricks on you to convince you, essentially, of why you need to stay with this person. So think about it. If I'm not good enough, if I'm too much, nobody's going to love me. And they're probably telling you this too. No one else will love me like this. I can never go out on my own. I'm not a good mother, or I can't imagine dating somebody else. We get kind of pigeonholed into this is the only partner. And they reinforce that. And then we also, at the same time, believe there's nobody as good as this. I mean, he is like walking on water in my world. And the cognitive dissonance that we have, where 1 minute everything's great, the next minute everything's horrible and we get confused, it plays into that as well, right? So that continues to build up over time in the abuse. And for anxiously attached people, this is the key for people to hear this. This is like the number one thing, if you can remember this. Our attachment system makes us crave proximity to the person we're attached to more than safety. This, to me, is the crux of this trauma bond. My system is freaking out unless I am close or feeling like our attachment is not threatened. I don't care how unsafe or dangerous it is. That's not important because attachment is all about survival. It's often not very rational. It's something that has evolved in us over time, probably started when we were cave people. And that is meant to keep, we've learned that's the only way I can stay safe is to be close. So if your body, your attachment system is on high alert, like, do not leave this person or you will die. I mean, that's essentially what it's telling you.
And it feels like it. Yes.
Right? And you get either rejected or you start to fear that they're leaving or discarding you in some way. Your system is, all you can do is ruminate about it. You're having panic attacks or feeling panicky, everything you can do to try to get back, right? And then if you add the personality traits that believe, well, we can make this work. He'll get better, all those things. I mean, it's just like this huge salad of like all the perfect ingredients to keep you stuck. And here we are blaming people thinking that they're stupid or like just some freaking doormat who can't say no to this. That is not the case.
Yeah. I noticed there's a real lack of empathy, which I always find so ironic, right? A lack of empathy.
Right.
We have this lack of empathy for women in particular, but victims in general, but women in particular who stay with an abusive man or get with an abusive man. And it's like, well, you picked him, you chose him, you stayed, you knew what he was like. And it's like, did you know there's this concept? It's this really new concept. Nobody's ever heard of it before. It's called lying. People lie. People con you. People play the long game. Like
right?
We know that people lie and there's no evidence to support that men lie more than women. I found that interesting. I have to admit, I was thinking possibly it was more male. I can't find any research to support it, so I'm probably wrong. Must just be my own experience. But they lie so much. People, abusers, lie so much. And yes, they can lie for a year, multiple years. And even then, people act like 1 minute they're nice and the next minute they're abusive. And then it stays that way. The thing with these abusive relationships that really triggers all of your attachment, triggers your confusion, is that there's an oscillation between kindness and cruelty. So the person who hurts you is exactly the same person that comforts you. And to your point, we're seeking that out because anything else is too much for our brains to accept. So we stay and we unconsciously rationalize, but it can happen to anyone. We can all do it. I always find it so interesting. You see like people very critical of victims online. And then you go to their bio and you see they're very religious, very Christian. And I'm like, wait a minute, aren't you all about forgiveness? So you're the same person that's saying, I would never let a man treat me like that, is the same person who's preaching forgiveness. How does that go together? If your value is forgiveness and divorce is not ideal, you would try to stay and forgive. And we're forgetting that it's not a choice. My partner is abusive and I choose to stay. That's not really what's happening. Not at all.
Yeah. It drives me crazy to see the hypocrisy in all of it. And part of what also gets so confusing, kind of along the lines of what you're saying, is when we look at sexism and the oppression of women in our culture, that's such another aspect of it. It's like women get told, or we get the messages along the way, and, it can come from society, it can come from religious beliefs, it can come from our families of origin, that we do still get this idea that the man is in charge, or like we should be more submissive in some way. And we're kind of this inferior gender. And even if you are, I have been a staunch feminist my whole life. I try to help women with that. And I've also had to confront some of those beliefs that were there, even with my relationships, which I'm like, God, I can't believe that's still wired into me. It's a lot less now in this point in my life, but, that can also be a factor in this, that, we blame women for staying, and yet we are not looking at the system that women are living in. We don't blame the system that sets women up to be dependent on men, to sometimes be the person who stays at home and takes care of the kids or gives up their career for 20 years to do that, or we can't earn the same living wage as men. There's so many factors here. And then, let's not have empathy for women when they're stuck in a relationship like this. Because many women have no resources to leave and or they're terrified to leave.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
It makes it sound so easy, right? All you have to do is leave. All you have to do is know that it's abuse and then uproot your entire life and give up your family, custody of your children, half of your money, your car, your life, and everything you know to be normal. Just that's all you have to do. It's so easy.
Yep, just leave.
Meanwhile, interestingly, just to even connect this, for those that haven't watched our previous episode about not knowing that it's abuse, I actually think that's a massively important piece to kind of connect here is that we act like we know, okay, it's abuse and now you should leave when abuse feels ambiguous. And I don't think that it is. I think that there's nuance and context, but I don't think abuse is confusing. Don't get me wrong, being in an abusive relationship is confusing. But on the outside, what it is, to me, I can define it quite easily. I think that there's a sort of, oh, you women call everything abuse now. That's just gaslighting, which is part of what makes it so confusing. The amount of people that are like, that's not abuse when it absolutely is. The amount of people pushing back on topics like emotional abuse and sexual coercion. And so once you even piece together that it's abuse, you have to get past all of these values and attachments and personality traits that make you who you are to realize that it's abuse. And then you have to do the really hard part of taking action, all while you are confused and trauma bonded and deeply experiencing traumatic cognitive dissonance. Like it's really no picnic, but we just focus on you should have left. You shouldn't have picked this person and you're weak. I know, the belief that women in particular are weak or traumatized or came from abusive households in order to get themselves into an abusive relationship. It's not actually true. We know that, but it's still a very prevalent belief where it's actually, things that we've been talking about, like obviously attachment, but a lot of people think like, no, my childhood was great. I had a good childhood. But when you dig in, don't you sort of hear things in your practice like neglect and inconsistency and performance-based love and things like that?
Absolutely. And I think it's, the research that Sandra Brown and Purdue University did showed that there were, it confronted this belief that people that get abused in these relationships come from childhood trauma or what we call high ACE events. There's a thing called the ACE study that showed like adverse childhood experiences where we had, you can kind of look at this list of all the quote unquote traumatic, big T traumatic down to like my parents got divorced, which is also traumatic for kids. So you look at all these things and the assumption was that people would have a high ACE scores or abuse in childhood that led them to these relationships. That research showed that that was not true. My dream someday is to do a research study and look at the attachment styles combined with this too. But for that study, it shows this. So this goes back to those of you who have been survivors who are like, I grew up in this healthy home. I didn't have anything horrible happen. I've got a PhD. I'm wildly successful in my career. Like, how did this happen to me? Again, it's not about you being weak, unaware, whatever. It's that you were preyed upon for your goodness, for your heart, for all those traits that we've talked about today that are perfect for a narcissist or psychopath or sociopath to bond and grow in a relationship.
Yeah. People will exploit you if they can, but I want that to be clear if they can rather than if you let them. Because the expression like people treat you how you let them or you teach people how to treat you. I don't agree with that blanket statement. I can see where it came from. I get it, but I actually hate it because it just puts the blame onto, well, you're letting it happen. And it's like, sure, if we can ignore everything about conditioning and trauma bonding and cognitive dissonance and value and personality traits and attachment, sure, it's your fault. You have to do some real mental gymnastics to me to land on it's the victim's fault for what happened to them. We need to take responsibility for our lives now and figure out how to get ourselves out in a way that doesn't blame us for getting into this in the first place because you didn't raise yourself and you don't know what you don't know. I think it's hard for us to look back and remember what it was like when we didn't know all of this stuff, before you're a therapist, but for the rest of us that had never even heard of attachment theory, for people who didn't know what cognitive dissonance was, never even heard of a trauma bond. If you thought that abuse was he's punching you, not the covert, insidious kind of abuse that you can often see in these pathological character disturbed type of personalities. It's hard. You can't just cast all that aside and then say you picked them. It's really unfair given the way that women especially are socialized to tolerate harm and explain harm and endure and be empathetic and be forgiving and understanding. You think about what people describe as a good woman, right? And it's all of those things. Meanwhile, on the flip side, we're saying at the first sign of any abuse, divorce your husband immediately. Which is it? Which one? For those that are looking to kind of, heal, learn how to get out of this, I obviously, both of us recommend therapy. I'm a certified coach, so I think that anyone who is qualified and anybody who can speak to this experience and knows the steps, like always be careful who you work with, but there's options out there for everyone. And just as a little aside, I don't want to turn this into a big pitch, but Chelli and I host a membership club called She Rises Collective, and it's online. It's for anyone who's in or out of an abusive relationship and you want to heal, rebuild, exit the relationship if you're still in it, or learn about the patriarchy and, learn about unlearning the patriarchy, I think is a better way to put that. Learn what got you here, the systems, rather than you got yourself here, but what systems got you here. It's an amazing space. And I know we're both very passionate about that club.
Absolutely. I love it so much. The women in it are amazing and just doing such hard work to explore, build their awareness of this and do healing and in various stages of their relationships. So yeah, I like you, I don't want it to feel like a sales pitch here, but it is a growing community and it can be very helpful, especially with a lot of touch points throughout each week where you can come in and meet with Lisa or I for coaching and just get a ton of support from the community and lots of opportunities for education as well.
Yeah. And I think, the more you know, I love that expression because I really see it as when you start to learn what got you here and you start to learn like what is the trauma bond and how can I rebuild and what roles have I played in my own life and how did I get conditioned? It's so fascinating. I love the work and I see it help so many people. So I certainly recommend She Rises to anybody, but I recommend exploring yourself with curiosity, not with judgment, and really learn that this wasn't you being weak, right? You were chosen because you are strong. You were chosen because you're capable, and attachment can make you hopeful. It doesn't make you foolish. So to anybody escaping a relationship like this and healing from it, it's not your fault. And any last words from you, Chelli, before we wrap up?
Oh, I just want to echo all of that. Just know that, there's like levels of being in a relationship like this. And usually when people are saying just leave or you're blaming yourself, like I should have seen this or I should just be able to leave. Why can't I? That's up here. And your nervous system is traumatized and being hijacked essentially by this predator who has taken over your life. And your body is screaming confusion, but also survival. And your survival instincts can look very different from what it says up here. So up here says leave and in here says stay. And so it's really important to again, like Lisa said, work with somebody who understands that and can help you navigate that because it's just not as simple as up here. People really have to understand that and be kind to yourself around that. This is one of the most difficult things you might do in your life is to figure out, leave or heal from these relationships. And it was one of mine too.
Yeah, I found it the hardest thing I've ever done. So 10 out of 10 do not recommend for anybody to do this. No abusive relationship. So get the education, learn, but I hope this was really helpful in having people not blame themselves or feel that they were weak. So thank you so much, Chelli, for being here. And we'll see everyone on the next video.
Thank you, Lisa, so much. It was an honor. Goodbye, everybody.